Today, a judge delayed testimony in Paul Manafort's trial by 6 days to allow Manafort's new lawyers more time to review documents. If those lawyers end up appealing something in the Manafort case all the way to the United States Supreme Court, it is possible that two Trump-appointed justices will hear that appeal if Brett Kavanaugh is confirmed. And tonight, Senate staffers are studying Judge Kavanaugh's comments about investigating presidents as those staffers prepare for Judge Kavanaugh's confirmation hearing. We are 1 day away from the 44th anniversary of the Supreme Court ruling in the Nixon case.
Good morning. The Supreme Court has just ruled on the tapes controversy, and here's Carl Stern, who has that ruling.
It is a unanimous decision, Doug, 8-0. Justice Rehnquist took no part in the decision ordering the President of the United States to turn over the tapes.
It's an 8-0 unanimous opinion that President Nixon must obey the subpoenas issued by Special Watergate Prosecutor Leon Jaworski and turn over 64 disputed White House tapes to Mr. Jaworski. What we do not know yet is whether or not the President will obey that order.
Of course, President Nixon decided he had no choice. He had to obey that order, and he turned over the Watergate tapes in just 15 days. After that ruling by the Supreme Court, President Nixon was forced to resign his presidency. In new documents released to the Senate Judiciary Committee, Supreme Court nominee Brett Kavanaugh once suggested that the Supreme Court may have gotten the Nixon decision wrong. In a 1999 roundtable discussion, Brett Kavanaugh said, quote, "But maybe Nixon was wrongly decided, heresy though it is to say so. Nixon took away the power of the president to control information in the executive branch by holding that the courts had power and jurisdiction to order the president to disclose information in response to a subpoena sought by a subordinate executive branch official. That was a huge step with implications to this day that most people do not appreciate sufficiently. Maybe the tension of the time led to an erroneous decision." But as the Associated Press reports, Brett Kavanaugh had a more favorable assessment of the Nixon case in a 2016 Law Review article in which he wrote, "Whether it was Marbury or Youngstown or Brown or Nixon, some of the greatest moments in American judicial history have been when judges stood up to the other branches, were not cowed, and enforced the law. That takes backbone, or what some call judicial engagement." Joining our discussion now, Jill Wine-Banks, former Assistant Watergate Special Prosecutor and an MSNBC legal analyst, and Ron Klain, former Chief of Staff to Vice Presidents Joe Biden and Al Gore, and a former senior aide to President Obama. He's also the former Chief Counsel of the Senate Judiciary Committee, where Senate confirmation hearings for Supreme Court justices take place. And Jill, a little 44-year retrospective there that you remember well, the Supreme Court decision, and then the president basically complying with the subpoena that you and your associates had directed toward the president's tapes. What do you make of what we're seeing in Brett Kavanaugh's history on this subject?
Well, first of all, hearing that announcement sent chills down my spine in remembering the thrill of the victory of winning that case and knowing that we would get the tapes. That was really an amazing experience.
But Jill, can I hold you right there for a second? Because
sure.
one of the notes that I didn't remember until I just heard it was the suspense question of would the president comply and follow the decision issued by the Supreme Court. How much of that suspense did you feel?
We definitely worried about whether he would and what we would do if he didn't. The same question as to how do you serve a subpoena is, how would you seize the records? How could you get into the White House to get the tapes if he did not comply? That would have been an issue. And I think what worries me is that with this president, you don't know that he has any respect for the rule of law and that he might not comply. That is a very scary thing to think about. I worry about that, I really do, and I think that Judge Kavanaugh's comments are not only unduly deferential to presidential power, but they ignore that giving that kind of power to him, as he would probably do, would make him a dictator or a king. It would not be someone who was functioning under the rule of law. The decision was correctly decided. It was a unanimous decision with one abstention because of a member of the court having been appointed and worked on it.
And Ron Klain, you've worked on so many Senate confirmations of Supreme Court justices. You come across snippets of comments like this from the nominees at different times. Sometimes they are hugely meaningful, sometimes not. Is there a way of weighing these Kavanaugh comments?
Well, look, I think it's a very big deal, Lawrence, because it's a comment on an issue that, as Jill suggested, is front and center in our civic life right now. Is the president above the law? Does this president intend to hold himself above the law? Can he be made accountable? And if Brett Kavanaugh means what he said in 1999, the answer to all that would be no. The answer to that would be it would not take a Saturday night massacre to get rid of Bob Mueller. It would just take a Saturday night email to get rid of Bob Mueller if Brett Kavanaugh's right about what he said in 1999. Because his point in that piece, Lawrence, is, hey, the president can't be accountable, can't be forced to turn over information to any subordinate officer in the executive branch. And if that's the law, then Bob Mueller is really standing on not even thin ice, no ice at all, in Brett Kavanaugh's view.
But, Ron, let me just go to your experience with seeing this kind of material in the confirmation process. Sometimes you see a statement like that in 1999 in which he's in a kind of panel discussion and he might be speculating and might be being more provocative in order to get a conversation going. And then you see years later he's written something that's very respectful of the Nixon case, putting it down with Marbury versus Madison as one of the most important cases that the Supreme Court should be proud of. How do you weigh those two different things?
Well, I think you have to look at the entire record here. We also have the piece that Kavanaugh wrote that we discussed on your show the night he was named, where he said, you know, he now worked at the White House. The president really shouldn't be bothered by investigations. You put that together, and it's going to be a very significant thing. And one other thing, Lawrence, you know, Brett Kavanaugh is going to sit in front of that committee, and he's going to bark about respect for precedent, respect for precedent, respect for precedent. But he was willing in 1999 to consider overturning an 8-0 decision of the Supreme Court that was 40 years old, that was decided about the same time as Roe versus Wade. So I think this quote from 1999 is also going to go to the question of whether or not he respects precedent and whether or not he's willing to overturn long-standing Supreme Court decisions.
Jill, what kind of answer could Judge Kavanaugh give in his confirmation hearing that would satisfy you on this subject?
There probably is none that will satisfy me. I see his comment as another blinking red light that it should warn us all, and that the Republicans and Democrats in red states should take very seriously. I think we need to make sure, and Ron wrote a wonderful article that makes this point, is that we need to see the paper trail. We need to see all of the documents, and the Republicans cannot get away with saying, oh, no.
Thanks for checking out our YouTube channel. Subscribe by clicking on the button below for more from The Last Word and the rest of MSNBC.